Hello and welcome to the History of Bangalore. I am Ramjee Chandran and I thank you for joining me for episode 73. When we left the story in the previous episode, Kempe Gowda had been summoned to the Vijayanagara court, arrested and confined at Anegundi. His territories, including the Bengaluru Pete, had been placed under custody, under imperial control, and administration of the region had passed on to another Palegar, Venkata Raya of Channapatna, Kempe Gowda's arch rival and the reason he got arrested in the first place. In this episode, I move away from Bengaluru and get back to Vijayanagara to see what was happening at the imperial capital. This is especially important because those events of the mid to the late 1500s changed the course of history in the Mysore Deccan and by that Bengaluru. So I will dive right into Vijayanagara, but not without taking a moment to thank my sponsors, the Prestige Group, who make it possible for me to bring you this podcast. Building cities, one landmark at a time, they transform dreams into reality. You can be a part of the future. Simply add prestige to your life. Achyuta Raya did not have a moment of peace. His accession to the throne had been ordained by his illustrious brother, Krishnadeva Raya, but it was at most a compromised decision. There had been another contender for the throne, Krishnadeva's son-in-law, Aliya Rama Raya. Achyuta inherited an empire, but he did not inherit the personal dominance that had allowed his brother to restrain rival ambitions and do as he pleased. From the start of his reign, Achyuta ruled within a court where the powerful nobles, commanders, and royal relatives all started to influence and assert their authority and, importantly, their autonomy. Aliya Rama Raya soon became the most significant of these figures. He was a man of military experience and political ambition. Under his father-in-law, Krishnadeva Raya, he had risen steadily. Under Achyuta Raya, his influence expanded even further. He cultivated allies, placed members of his own family, the Aravidu clan, who would go on to become the fourth dynasty of Vijayanagara. Achyuta, quite correctly, relied on Aliya Rama Raya's abilities, but he also recognized the danger of that reliance. So in response, and to counterbalance Rama Raya's growing power, he promoted his own relatives, especially Tirumala Salakaraju, his brother-in-law, brother to his chief queen Baladambika. Now, these proxies are always trouble, and court politics hardened into factional alignments. Decisions were influenced by rivalry as much as by policy. Until about 1533, Krishnadeva Raya's grandson was still alive, and though he was too young to rule, he represented a continuation of that royal line. So as long as the child was alive, there could be no legitimate claimants to the throne. Any attempt to displace Achyuta carried the risk of resistance, rallied around the child's future claims, and none of the nobles or none of the military would have stood for it. But when that infant prince died in 1533, that constraint was removed. The dynastic field had narrowed down, and Rama Raya saw a path to the throne. He had always been one of the aspirants to the throne, but now there emerged a few legitimate successors, and naturally, the political temperature at the court had changed. Actions that had earlier required discretion were now openly pursued. The rivalry between Achyuta Raya and Rama Raya moved from gentle maneuvering within the system to attempts to control the system itself. The turning point in all this came when Rama Raya grew impatient, and now he made a direct bid for power. In the period 1535 to 1536, he arrested Achyuta Raya and placed him under confinement within the palace. But it's one thing to imprison the emperor. Rama Raya now faced a practical problem. Usurped authority requires resources. Supporters had to be rewarded, and he needed control of the treasury. This is best illustrated by a fascinating story of what followed. Rama Raya had embarked on a campaign in the southwest, inside the Kerala country, against the Malabar kingdom, Tiruvadi Rajyam. Having detained Achyuta Raya in custody, Rama Raya left Vijayanagara in the control of a man who has been described, and I'm sure quite wrongly, as a servant, or worse, a slave. On his way back to Vijayanagara after that Malabar campaign, Rama Raya was in need of funds, but he had stopped to address a problem of a wayward zamindar who had rebelled against the kingdom and admirably held out against Vijayanagara troops for 6 months. So, while he was in need of this money, he wrote to this servant in Vijayanagara and asked that servant to send him money. An aside now to determine the meaning of the word servant. Some historians have actually used the phrase mere servant while describing this incident. None of the sources give us the man's name, and Farishta refers to him as a slave, but that description just tells us more about Farishta's categories than about the man's actual position. Indeed, in epigraphical or in historical accounts, even the most senior ministers are often referred to as servants of the king, and linguists might explain that the word servant in this case simply meant someone who performed a service. He could be a general rather than household menial help as we understand it to be in the modern day. Arabic, Persian similarly reference such people as slaves. Now the name Abdul, for instance, simply means slave to God and not an indentured servant to another human being like household help. The fact that Rama Raya had left this man in charge of the city, the treasury and its keys meant that he was more likely a very important bureaucrat. But this was a bureaucrat who refused Rama Raya's request for money. Clearly, his loyalties lay with Achyuta Raya, his king. By refusing to release funds, he struck at the very heart of Rama Raya's attempt to consolidate power and take it away from a now powerless Achyuta Raya. And Rama Raya was stuck. He had control over the military. That did matter, but control over money mattered just as much, if not more. Without access to the treasury, Rama Raya could not stabilize his position and he could do nothing. The so-called servant then acted further. He released Achyuta Raya, his lawful king. Loyal attendants and guards were alerted. Achyuta was brought out of confinement and restored to visibility and to the throne. And then, finally, because even more consolidation was required, the servant sought the assistance of Salakaraju Tirumala and brought him into the conflict. Once Achyuta Raya had been freed, the balance shifted rapidly. Several nobles, unhappy, disgusted even with Rama Raya's administration, rallied around their lawful king, Achyuta Raya. And thus Achyuta assumed the throne. But he did not order reprisals or stage public punishments. Instead, he rewarded loyalty. This palace official, or servant as he was called, who had refused Rama Raya's demand for money, was elevated to the position of chief minister. We still don't know his name. All of these events scarred Vijayanagara's political soul. The authority of kingship no longer rested solely on ritual sovereignty. It had been reduced to transaction. And confining a king had become a socially accepted instrument of political struggle. So, although Achyuta had regained the throne, stability had not returned to Vijayanagara, and the relationship between Achyuta and Rama Raya had remained unresolved, while factional conflicts continued. All this internal disorder soon created an opening for external intervention, and there followed the unlikely involvement of the Adil Shahs of Bijapur, these being the mortal enemy of Vijayanagara, as a mediator. This happened because the involvement of Salakaraju Tirumala only complicated things even further. He had asserted himself at the time of freeing Achyuta, and he seized control of palace affairs. He then murdered that faithful servant who was now chief minister and assumed the management of the state for himself. Achyuta was still rattling around as a non-entity for all these reasons. The principal adversaries were now Aliya Rama Raya and Salakaraju Tirumala, and they went to war. It was in the Battle of Bengaluru in the early part of 1535 that things came to a head, and Salakaraju had to retreat from that battle and come heading right back to Vijayanagara. And it was somewhere in 1536 that Rama Raya's march reached the outskirts of Vijayanagara. Now, the complicated nature of loyalties in this time was illustrated by a grant that Rama Raya made of the village of Nittur near Tekkalakota in the merit of Achyuta Raya, which is usually done when you swear allegiance to that king. Now, this granted Nittur also showed how dangerously close to Vijayanagara Rama Raya had advanced. His plan was clear: attack the capital, take the throne. He had been an aspirant for a very long time. But the highly perturbed Salakaraju, in his panic, turned to help to Ibrahim Adil Shah, the Sultan of Bijapur. He offered Adil Shah 3 lakh hoons, which I presume is the same as Hana, for each day that Adil Shah's army marched. The money-hungry Ibrahim Adil Shah marched at once into Vijayanagara. When he got there, Salakaraju gave him a grand reception, seated him on the throne, and arranged several days of festivities. Now, the presence of Adil Shah and his army would have meant that Rama Raya had to abandon any plans he may have had to attack Vijayanagara. And then, immediately afterwards, at the insistence of Achyuta and Salakaraju, the warring Vijayanagara parties came to the table to reach a settlement, to negotiate. Around this table was a rather motley assemblage: the ruling king, Tuluva Achyuta Raya, his brother-in-law, Tirumala Salakaraju, Krishnadeva Raya's son-in-law, Aravidu Aliya Rama Raya, the key aspirant to the throne, and the Bijapur Sultan, Ibrahim Adil Shah, sitting in as arbitrator, deciding who would be the king of Vijayanagara. How did these strange proceedings proceed? And now for a very short commercial break, after which I will move to the answer to that question and the rest of the troubles of Vijayanagara. Right after this.
Maximum connectivity, maximum luxury, maximum lifestyle. Live your max at Prestige Raintree Park. Opulent residences nestled in 21 acres of breathtaking landscape with 1 lakh plus square feet of clubhouse, 3 swimming pools, and ample leisure and sports amenities. Experience exquisite living at Prestige Raintree Park in prime Whitefield with schools, offices, hospitals, and shopping malls just a hop away. Call 81399 81399 or visit prestigeconstructions.com to know more. Radar approved.
Hi, I'm back. At the court of a grateful and relieved Achyuta Raya, the arbitration proceedings chaired by Ibrahim Adil Shah came to a close. The terms were clear. Achyuta Raya was acknowledged as king. Rama Raya was permitted to rule his own estate or Jagir without interference. That done, the Sultan withdrew to Bijapur after having successfully inserted himself as an arbiter in Vijayanagara's internal politics. Contemporary sources, Nunez and Ferishta, both agree that immense amounts of gold were paid to Ibrahim Adil Shah to withdraw from Vijayanagara. One of them said that it was the equivalent of about £2 million sterling in the day. Peace accord apart, things were still in a mess. An emperor had been imprisoned and freed through palace intrigue. A bureaucrat, unnamed but powerful, had determined the outcome of the history of Vijayanagara. A Deccan Sultan, mortal enemies to Vijayanagara, had intervened and acted as an arbitrator and dictated terms, and also cleaned out a good part of Vijayanagara treasury. Vijayanagara's political order may have survived, but it had changed in fundamental ways. And we find ourselves at a moment of restored calm, but it concealed deep structural cracks, damage. The palace had learned how fragile authority could be and how easily it could be enforced through control rather than consensus. The settlement of 1535-1536 did bring about some temporary calm to Vijayanagara, and by this peace accord, Achyuta Raya would no longer be at war with Aliya Rama Raya. Ibrahim Adil Shah went back to Bijapur after cleaning out the Vijayanagara treasury, carrying off wealth and, importantly, prestige. In practice, the settlement exposed the limits of imperial authority. Achyuta Raya returned to the throne with his position secured by agreement rather than by dominance. The court had learned that power could be enforced through confinement, negotiation, and external pressures, and these are the lessons that influenced the final years of Achyuta Raya's reign. Between 1536 and 1542, Achyuta ruled a state that had remained strong only in appearance, but it was fragile in structure. All those factional rivalries had not disappeared, but they had just been contained temporarily. Rama Raya remained a powerful presence. He was still commanding loyalty and resource in his territory. Achyuta was relying on accommodation rather than confrontation. So governance became overcautious and totally defensive. This period also marked the steady rise of Rama Raya and his influence. Though formally outside the center of control, he continued to cultivate alliances. He maintained a great military strength, and he waited. The settlement allowed him time to study the court's weaknesses. Soon, Achyuta Raya's health declined towards the end of his reign, and towards 1940 through 1942, closer to the end, Rama Raya struck again. He seized Achyuta Raya and imprisoned him once more. No one came to mediate this time. Achyuta Raya died in 1542. He was succeeded by his son Venkata I. But in inscriptions, the date of the end of Achyuta Raya's rule conflicts with the beginning of his successor's rule, Venkata I. There seems to have been some overlap. This is the sort of ambiguity that mirrors the political confusion at the time in Vijayanagara. Achyuta's death reopened every unresolved question. His son Venkata was still a child, and then effective power passed on to Salakaraju Tirumala, who was appointed to act as regent. Once again, Salakaraju held the reins of empire. He controlled access to the young king. He controlled the palace. He understood the lessons of the previous decade. Authority rested on custody and command, not on lineage alone. Salakaraju Tirumala subsequently tried to usurp the throne. He murdered the young Venkata and a whole bunch of other royal family members. For all his brazen actions, people in the court called Tirumala Salakaraju the Mad One, Uche Timma in Kannada. And the nobles were upset and terrified with what Salakaraju might do to Vijayanagara next. So they appealed to Rama Raya. Some went so far as to urge Adil Shah to depose Salakaraju and even offered him the kingdom if the country could be freed from the grip of this tyrant. But there is no record of any Bijapur or any other Bahmani Sultan getting involved in arbitration this time. Salakaraju's rise obviously did not sit well with Aliya Rama Raya, and so he decided that he was going to make a final and decisive bid for the throne. Learning from his past mistakes, he did not attempt to seize the throne directly this time. Instead, he identified a claimant whose legitimacy was unquestionable. And that someone was Sadashiva, son of Rangaraya, who was Achyuta's oldest brother. His claim rested firmly within the Tuluva line. He had not been politically active. He was vulnerable, and he was kept away from the center of power. In fact, Sadashiva was confined to the fortress at Gutti. And then there was a major conflict with Salakaraju, and it ended in a battle on the banks of the Tungabhadra, and Rama Raya defeated and killed Salakaraju Tirumala. And then in 1543, Rama Raya marched back into Vijayanagara and installed Sadashiva on the throne. With this act, Rama Raya achieved what he had failed to achieve earlier. He now controlled the empire, but he did not claim kingship. Sadashiva was crowned emperor. His name appears in charters and inscriptions, but Rama Raya governed the empire. Now, he didn't do this clandestinely, he did this openly and decisively. He appointed his own brothers, Tirumala and Venkatadri, as his closest associates. Together, they controlled the administration, the military command, and diplomacy. And the power now came to be concentrated within a single family group, the Aravidus. In the years to come, Rama Raya changed how the court functioned. Anyone who fell out of favor found themselves cut off from access before they could even gather any support. Rama Raya ruled this way because of what he had lived through. He had helped imprison a reigning emperor. He had seen that same emperor freed because one man controlled the treasury and palace access. He had learned that money could decide loyalty faster than titles. He watched a Deccan Sultan march into Vijayanagara and force a settlement. These experiences taught him that power came from controlling people, movement, and resources, and not from kingship alone. In his reign by proxy, Rama Raya pursued an assertive policy towards the Bahmani Sultanates, interfering in their succession disputes, supporting rival claimants. He shifted alliance to maintain advantage when it suited him. Such strategies produced short-term gains, but it also accumulated resentment. and a terrible price would be paid for this arrogance. In the Vijayanagara court, this culture of ruling by suspicious control started to radiate from the palace to the provinces. The atmosphere had deteriorated into this ambience of suspicion, and Rama Raya seemed wary and suspicious of everyone and everything. His inability to place trust in anyone included the Palegals who ran the provinces, even though they were essential to the functioning of the state. They collected the revenue, they maintained the law and order, they commanded the forts and towns. But when a Palegar became successful and visible, he was seen as a threat. Visibility carried risk. And Rama Raya's empire started to equate any kind of autonomous strength with political challenge. This showed in the emperor's attitude. There were summons to Palegars when once there was respectful consultation. Detention became a routine instrument of governance. Loyalty was assessed through compliance rather than by trust. And the ones most trusted were the ones who curried favor and carried tales. And the ones who went about achieving things were viewed with suspicion. Clearly, it was to such an environment that a high achiever like Kempe Gowda would fall victim. The successes of the Bengaluru Pete were visible. His revenue base had expanded. His town attracted attention. In the Vijayanagara of Rama Raya, such visibility invited scrutiny. And this is the sort of thing that made it easy for jealous rivals like Jagadeva Raya, the Channapatna Padegar, to carry tales about Kempe Gowda minting his own coinage to Rama Raya that led to Kempe Gowda's arrest. This shift in the attitude of the Vijayanagara court had immediate consequences across the Mysore Deccan. Towns and territories that had depended on clear imperial backing found themselves exposed to court politics. Administrative decisions had become unpredictable. In such a climate, securing one's own future became a rational response, and the impulse to consolidate power closer to home did not rise from rebellion. It rose from uncertainty and self-protection. Therefore, it is completely understandable that Kempe Gowda's unease likely began years before his arrest. His mentor and patron Achyuta Raya had lost his political constituency many years before his death. In the court of Rama Raya, where imperial backing had become fragile and political power could only come from proximity to him, Kempe Gowda would have sensed that the ground beneath him was shifting and that trouble was coming. So maybe he did mint those coins after all. We will never know for sure. In this episode, I followed the story at the center, the palace intrigues, the settlements, and the rise of a new political order. In the next episode, the cataclysmic events of the last of the political order of Vijayanagara and the birth of politics in the Mysore Deccan. That is coming up very soon. I am Ramjee Chandran, and this is the history of Bangalore.